there are 3 games that all released relatively close to each other that have all left a mark on me. Games that, while different in delivery, thematics, and what they all set out to achieve, have all been inherently tied to each other in my mind. Whether if that's due to the time frame these games were released in, or how their combat systems are all relatively similar, or maybe it could be the fact that I just played them all back to back. Shit, maybe it's a mixture of all of it. Who really knows? These 3 are still great games that I highly recommend to this day, the 2 of which I had already talked about in length in previous videos, with those 2 games being Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor and Rocksteady's Arkham Knight. Games that still hold up incredibly well by today's standards mechanically, and I guess story-wise. I mean, each one of them did have their own criticisms on their story, but visually they are still jaw-dropping, particularly in the case of the Arkham Knight. You could say this game was released yesterday and visually no one would argue with you. I mean, it looks leagues better than the tragedy of this game. I mean, it runs a lot better too. Arkham Knight, or I guess really any of the Arkham games from Rocksteady, are often used as a baseline, a reference for games with this particular hand-to-hand combat style. It's only natural for people to compare them with Rocksteady. Whether people are correct in their thinking or not, most credit them for innovating, evolving, and ultimately perfecting this type of combat system down to a science. The fact people were comparing Spider-Man 2018 and Miles Morales to Arkham Knight's fluidity in combat, and continue to do so using Arkham Knight as some type of blueprint on what they hope Insomniac to deliver on in their sequel that's set to release sometime this year, a game that's been out 3 years prior to Spider-Man 2018 and almost 8 years to Spider-Man 2's release, assuming of course it does release in 2023, just goes to show how talented Rocksteady was in this area, and it'll be both a long time and a very hard uphill battle for any other developer to create a game that's seen as superior to Rocksteady's hand-to-hand combat system, or even an equal to base future games combat off of. The Spider-Man games were subjected to this high level of contrast. The Middle-earth games were as well when they were released, and so was Mad Max. Coincidentally, like Arkham and the Middle-earth games, Mad Max was also published by Warner Brothers. I don't know if that's really of any significant importance, but it felt like it was still worth mentioning. Mad Max, like many games before it and after it, didn't get too much love and attention from people when it initially released, with the bottom line being, the game added nothing new to the genre, with it being rated as mediocre with a ground combat system similar to the Arkham games, giant empty open world, confusing early stage mission design, repetitive side missions, and quests that hindered the game's replay value, and at times, the combat and extra activities in the open world were seen as grindy, with the game's only saving grace being its vehicle combat, something that was fun, addictive, and adrenaline fueled. I also remember some people praising the game, in particular for its explosions and fire effects, which in most games for some reason fire never looks quite right. But those were obviously more on the negative side of things, sentiments that I don't want to repeat here myself without revisiting the game. So why don't you say we load up our shotgun, strap some pieces of metal scrap to our knuckles, grab a fuel can of gasoline, and return to the plains of silence. Without a doubt, this has to be the worst part of the entire game. The story, I mean, you can follow it if you want, but truth be told, its main purpose is to drive the momentum of the game forward by unlocking newer areas, meeting different leaders in said areas, which in turn open up side quest opportunities that are there to aid Max in his real goal, building a vehicle called the Magnum Opus, the toughest, fastest vehicle in the entire region. But in spite of that, let's discuss the story, or at least braze over it. The game starts up with Max entering the Plains of Silence in search for fuel. He ends up getting intercepted and ambushed by the War Boys, a group of marauders led by a man called Scabrous Scrotus. Yeah, he's actually named after his scrotum. And as if that isn't badass enough, he ends up getting his own chainsaw impaled through his own forehead by a man he had just stripped butt-ass naked, carjacked, and pistol whipped a bunch of times. That's a great start. With Max left to die in the desert, he recruits Scabby Scrotum's best friend, the dog who had tried to maul him a few moments earlier. The two of them run into a hunchback by the name of Chumbucket, who serves as Max's on-demand mechanic, providing immediate field repairs to any damage his vehicle may have sustained. While he does indeed provide a gameplay purpose for fixing your car, Chumbucket is also responsible for upgrading your car, narratively speaking, as he not only has the technical skills required to build the car he himself has promised Max, but he's also your guide, who rules, or rather holds a stronghold in a particular portion of the game's map that is holding, let's say, a protracted war against Scrotus and his war boys. Chumbucket knows. He's your mechanic, your guide, and, let's say, your advisor, on not only who runs what stronghold, but how and where to find the necessary parts to rebuild your car. It's through Chumbucket's knowledge and skilled mechanical hands that Max is is able to get all the way to Gastown, his initial destination prior to being carjacked, as it's the main location he can find the fuel he needed. It's only after reaching Gastown that he discovers Scrotus is still alive and actually embraced the chainsaw Max left impaled in his forehead as a new ornament or trophy of sorts. Truth be told, like I said earlier, the story isn't much, with the main focus of it very intimately tied to the main focus of the gameplay, which is all about building the toughest, fastest car that's more efficient at fighting the war boys in each location. Each one of the game's rulers that you're introduced to runs their own strongholds against Scrotus and his war boys, but these strongholds are really small milestones to introduce the player to various open world activities and unlocking certain things in the vehicle's progression. Items that are tied to offensive capabilities like the sniper rifle that's used to take down enemies from a distance, the harpoon, which is essentially just used as a means to tear shit down by using the sheer weight and power of your vehicle to dismantle enemy vehicles and outposts, the thunderpoon, essentially, which is the harpoon with an explosive tip. It's basically this game's version of a rocket launcher. And then of course we get defensive capabilities like cosmetic changes like added bar reinforcements around your vehicle, protecting it from being rammed, spikes that prevent enemies from jumping onto your car, new body chassis, paint jobs, or hood ornaments, which are decorations displayed on the front and back of your vehicle. Honestly, once you make it to Pikai's stronghold, this is the second out of the 3 rulers in the game, you've really seen most of what this game has to offer in terms of activities and how to unlock better items for your vehicle. There's also a weird love interest in the story. I don't really understand why it's there. Maybe it's meant to show Max still has some semblance of humanity and sanity in him, where he feels for this woman and her child that are forced to live this harsh life in the wastelands. I get it, everyone in this world has lost their way and things are different, so the fact this woman and her child are so quick to embrace Max as a new surrogate father for both protection and to have a complete family may make some sort of sense, but I just wasn't too into it. The only part about it that I did enjoy out of this love interest, spoiler alert if you care to keep this a secret, as I said before, I don't understand why you would want that considering the story is just really there, but consider this your only and final warning. But at the very end of the game, the 2 of them are killed and left on display for Max to find. This game seems to take the approach of Max slowly losing his sanity, and with the death of Glory and Hope, yes, that's actually the mom and child's name, you start to hear their voices slowly driving Max more and more over the edge on the path of vengeance, killing each and every single person that shows any type of allegiance to Scrotus or is part of the war boys. The voices, dominantly the child's, is very aggressive and encourages Max to shed their blood, and hearing these voices along with Square Enix taking the approach of Max going batshit crazy is something I particularly enjoyed. The ending is also kind of sad. I don't remember Max sacrificing the magnum opus and even Chumbucket's life in an attempt to avenge Hope and Glory. Maybe that was due to, in the past, I found Chumbucket to be whatever, and this time around, with me realizing he's the main, I guess, voice in the game, since Max himself doesn't talk all that much, just seemed crazy. And after about 15 plus hours of building this dream car with Chumbucket, Max just throws both the vehicle and his life away without a moment's hesitation, cold-blooded. As I said before, the story is there, but the real reason to play this game has absolutely nothing to do with the game's narrative and has everything to do with the gameplay. Mad Max's gameplay can easily be broken up into 2 parts, just like the combat itself. You have everything that takes place on foot, from scavenging for parts, fuel, finding collectibles, or killing half-naked men in the desert with your bare hands. Then you have the driving, which is said to take up about 60% of this game. And let me tell you, that's not a problem at all. This game's driving holds up phenomenally well. The magnum opus starts off a bit slow and a little harder to handle, but as you start throwing on upgrades, that easily starts to change. Most of the game's world is obviously sand with some areas of asphalt, the car being the only way to primarily get around from point A to point B. There is a fast travel system, but it requires you to either unlock the stronghold of that person in order to fast travel there, or head over to a hot air balloon. These are locations that sometimes are occasionally defended by a handful of Scrotus's men. Once you clear the area and take it all the way to the top, you can then use it as a means to lift this game's fog of war and reveal the many different activities around you. As previously said, once completed, that hot air balloon location can now be used as a fast travel position, which it's nice and relatively simplistic, with Mad Max's pretty decently sized map, the number of which is a bit of a double-edged sword. While it is convenient to be able to fast travel to almost every corner of this game's map, at times it can feel like there's a little too many hot air balloon locations, which can easily add to the grindy and repetitive nature so many lobbied against this game. But let's get back to focusing on the vehicle. Sound, design, overall control of the magnum opus, and waging war from the driver's seat is all amazing. Just driving out in the desert, you'll occasionally run into war parties or roaming vehicles vehicles that, once they pass you, will quickly start to turn around and engage you. In the early hours of the game, while there aren't too many vehicles that are thrown at you in these random patrols, it's still enough to give you a run for your money and get familiar with this game's basic car combat fundamentals. The magnum opus starts off a bit, as I said, slow with no real protection or reinforcement, so you gotta be careful with the damage you sustain. You also don't have too many tools to take out your enemies in the beginning. Max only has his shotgun and the harpoon. As you progress, you'll unlock a sniper rifle and a thunderpoon, which is, again, essentially this game's version of a rocket launcher. Eventually, this will be your best friend, and initially, on the surface, the combat within the vehicles can be pretty basic, with you using one of two methods. Either you're going to use your shotgun to take out the car's gas tank, which is an instant explosion, or you're going to use your vehicle as a battering ram. You do have a ram fitted to the front of your vehicle. There's also a mechanic to be able to ram sideways into enemy vehicles, so that's where a lot of the fun comes from. When you start to experiment, there's actually quite a few options here. Besides just using your vehicle as a literal battering ram and using your shotgun as an insta-kill, there's the thunderpoon, which can be a one-hit kill, or later on in the game when enemies have reinforced armor vehicles, you can use your thunderpoon to annihilate their armor. Then use a little bit more of an advanced method, and that's using the harpoon to either rip off one of the tires, instantly immobilizing their vehicle, or yanking the driver out of his vehicle. Well, on some degree, it is unfortunate that the thunderpoon and harpoon are on a reload timer and they share that timer. If you can master the type of gameplay of constantly cycling through different means of taking care of enemy vehicles, such as using your shotgun and then your vehicle as a battering ram, and then picking either the harpoon to yank off a tire or the thunderpoon to focus on a completely different enemy vehicle, so that way you can multitask, and you can do it in a way where, especially in the early hours of the game where your vehicle's not completely reinforced, this will help minimize the amount of time you gotta stop engaging the enemies to conduct a field repair. Then you can switch over to the thunderpoon for either an insta-kill or to knock off the enemy's armor. Fun and addictive. Honestly, if you don't mind experimenting and mixing up your enemy prioritization or even your methods of dealing with the enemies, the vehicle combat gets even more rewarding. After meeting with Gutgash, he'll introduce you to enemy convoys. The convoys, with the exception of this particular mission, you can take care of at your own leisure, and it's another open world activity, but this is where you're really going to get the majority of your vehicle combat from, with the main goal of them not only being, once you take them out, it reduces the enemy presence in that particular region, but upon completion you get a unique hood ornament for your vehicle. Personally, I wish there was more to it beyond just a trivial cosmetic reward, but it's better than nothing, I suppose. I'm gonna be honest, back when I originally played this, when it first released, I was absolutely in love with the vehicle combat, and it's still great to this day, don't get me wrong. I just gotta admit, I've come to appreciate the other side of the game's combat a bit more, and that's the hand-to-hand fighting. Very similar to the combat of the Middle-earth games, which in turn are accused of ripping off the Arkham-style flow of combat, there's a reason why people love them. Fundamentally, they are great at delivering this type of combat. I don't mean to keep comparing the three to each other, as they are obviously not all the same, and each game are developed by completely separate development teams, but I do keep mentioning them not as a point of comparison, but as a point of reference. And for reference, out of the three, Mad Max's are the most, I don't know if unforgiving or if clunky is the best word choice here, but the window to block an enemy's attack is a lot more specific than the Arkham, Middle-earth, or even Insomniac Spider-Man games. The combat style is very similar, with most of it being hand-to-hand fist fighting. Max at any point can use a shotgun to immediately kill off an enemy or clear out a war crier, which is basically a living alarm system that, if you let live for too long, actually makes all of the enemies you're engaging with become much more aggressive, making the war criers a high priority target whenever they are around, as they can instantly make any encounter very unnecessarily harder. Besides Max's shotgun, there's shivs you can use for instant takedowns, or thunderpoons for an insta-kill. Unlike the Arkham or Middle-earth games, where if your combo meter gets high enough, you can immediately take down or execute an enemy, for Max you enter Fury mode, where you deal more damage and take less. There's no real repercussions for taking hits while in Fury mode, besides exiting it sooner due to the hits being sustained, but the combat is pretty basic with not too much enemy variety. You learn how to deal with every enemy type after just a few engagements, with the only real threats becoming the number of enemies you have to take on at any specific time, or enemies that have shields, which eventually, as you progress and level Max up, you start unlocking abilities that make it easier to break these guys' shield. But even before that skill is unlocked, it's just a matter of really wearing wearing their shields down with a few jabs then dodging. The biggest threat, if you even want to call them that, are top dogs. These are basically miniature, I guess you can call them boss fights. At first they seem to be difficult until you realize that the fights are meant for, well, they're scripted, for a lack of a better term. You gotta wait for them to open themselves up for an attack. You hit them a few times and you gotta back up and wait for them to open themselves up again. It kind of sucks because if you really master the combat, you know, when they open themselves up to attack, you initiate a few jabs, hit them with an ignited gas tank or even a few shotgun shots, it does nothing. And it sucks ass that these fights are scripted like this, but I guess it's the devs' way of just not wanting you to really steamroll these guys over and wanting them to appear more of a challenge than they really are. They are few and in between though, as they're really used as the ultimate quote-unquote challenge you need to face in order to free the bigger enemy camps in the world. The last big pillar, so to speak, to be knocked down, as once they're taken care of, the camps that usually require you to defeat them grant better rewards, like a new body for your vehicle or a new paint job to sport. Ultimately, the combat is sort of basic, and one can even argue quote-unquote standard by today's point of view. But it got the job done at the time, and truthfully, as I said earlier, after all these years, I've come to really enjoy it as much as the other games that have a similar combat style. And if you don't mind its lack of real challenge or enemy variety, I still highly recommend this game, especially since it's always going on sale. I believe it was part of PlayStation Plus at a time. The other day, Steam was actually selling this game for like $3. I mean, if you're a fan of any type of driving games, appreciate vast open worlds that, yes, is practically barren with no real wildlife or things to do besides working on taking care of enemy outposts and patrols, or even scavenging for scrap here and there, which isn't much of a complaint since it's fun as hell to work on that stuff anyways. I'd still highly suggest giving this game a shot, even as a nice little time killer. It's one of those games for me that I find myself just driving around every now and again, because I personally don't play racing games or driving simulators, as weird as that sounds, but this kind of cuts it for me. But anyways, let me know what you think. Have you guys ever tried out Mad Max? Have you ever played it? Would you still be willing to give this game a shot? My only big complaint about it is the fact that they never came out with a new game plus. You know, as great as it is as taking out these enemy convoys, taking care of all these enemy camps, and working on building the fastest, strongest vehicle that you possibly can, when it's so intertwined into the progression of the game's story and its main goal ultimately forces you to knock these things out in a way where if you beat the main story, ultimately there's nothing left to do afterwards. So the lack of a new game plus kind of kills it in the end, but the journey of getting up to that point I think is still well worth it, especially if the game is constantly selling for like $5. That's Mad Max for you. Let me know what you guys think. In the meantime, maybe check out my video on the Callisto Protocol or the Dead Space remake. You know, maybe if you have that playing in the background as background noise, feel free to join the Discord. Link is down in the pinned comment. There's over 3,000 members, and if you're looking for someone to play a particular game with or just chat with, there's always interesting conversations going on in there. But until next time, I'll see you guys later.